Good evening and welcome. My name is Valerie Paley and I am the Sue Ann Weinberg Director of the Patricia D. Klingenstein Library at the New York Historical Society. And I got that out in one breath. Thank you so much for being here tonight. I am absolutely thrilled to welcome you to Primary Source. This is a brand new series of free and public programs exploring how the Patricia D. Klingenstein Library at the New York Historical Society supports new research and historical inquiry. For over 200 years, the library has documented our shared history through manuscripts, books, maps, newspapers, photographs, architectural drawings, prints, and more. These primary sources are available to researchers, students, and all those curious about our past and our present. Tonight, Meredith Mann, curator of manuscripts and archival collections here at the library and the host of our new series, will be speaking with John Wood Sweet about his powerful new book, The Sewing Girl's Tale, A Story of Crime and Consequences in Revolutionary New York, for which Dr. Sweet has received many prizes, including the Bancroft Prize, the Gotham Book Prize, and as of just yesterday evening, the Society of American Historians Francis Parkman Prize. I have to say, he gave quite a rousing and amusing speech as well. And we will be selling the book, and there will be a book signing after the program in the back. So please, the books are for sale over there. And now to our introductions. John Wood Sweet is a professor of history at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and former director of UNC's program in sexuality studies. He graduated from Amherst College and earned his PhD in history at Princeton. His first book, Bodies Politic, Negotiating Race in the American North, was a finalist for the Frederick Douglass Prize. He has served as a distinguished lecturer for the Organization of American Historians, as well as a library page and tour guide at Orchard House in Massachusetts, where Louisa May Alcott wrote Little Women. We are thrilled to welcome Professor Sweet, and now I will turn things over to Meredith to get us started.
Thank you, Valerie, and thank you all for joining us here. And I'm so excited to dig into this book, so I'm not going to waste any time. I'm just going to get straight to question number one. All right. So this book, The Sewing Girl's Tale, you had a long history with the story of Lana Sawyer, the protagonist of this book. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience with her and then what motivated you to start writing the book?
Yeah, I just first wanted to say I'm so happy to be back in this room without its tables. I spent a lot of time doing research here, and the collections here are so fundamental to our ability to tell stories about the past. So I'm very grateful for this society. This book tells a story that for a long time I thought I knew. I first encountered the report of the trial of Henry Bedloe, which was the first published report of a rape trial in American history. There are two copies in existence today. One of them is here at the Historical Society. The other one is in Worcester, Massachusetts. So just two institutions make the difference between our having a cultural memory of this trial and not. So I was introduced to this case and the trial record in graduate school. I was taking a class with Christine Stanzel, and it read so vividly like a modern date rape trial. And that was pretty much how I thought about it. That was right in the 1980s, just after Ms. Magazine had coined the term date rape. And I had friends who wrote really good scholarship about the trial, but I didn't really think I had much to contribute, so I used it in my teaching as an example of the origins of modern rape culture. And it really wasn't until about 15 years ago that a graduate student, I used to say 10 years ago, but I've been saying that, time passes. But it wasn't until about 15 years ago that a graduate student I was working with uncovered a reference in a New York newspaper to a publication in a Poughkeepsie newspaper that really shifted from 5 years after the rape trial, that really shifted my expectations about the story. And I realized as I began to research, I got curious, started researching. It really challenged my assumptions about the case and made me curious. And so that began this long research project. And the story at every turn got longer and stranger, and in some ways more devastating, and in some ways more relevant to the present.
And you really, it's funny that you say that this account was preserved in cultural memory by these two institutions, because really the fact that the case was even able to be preserved by having this proceeding was very uncommon. You assembled a slew of criminal cases from that time period, but the record keeping, the procedures of the era was not to record much more than the names of the individuals involved. So just the fact that you had the details to go on, to draw from, to tell the book is something miraculous or uncommon.
Yeah, it's extraordinary. It's true, the official minutes of this case are about, they're just a series of lists of names. And the jurors were impaneled, blah, 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 blah. And the witnesses were blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
And the verdict was returned. So it's like 100 words, maybe? Doesn't tell you anything, but the published report was not an official report. It was a report published by a spectator during the trial. He was an English attorney. He had been forced out of England because he had fought a duel and he'd wounded his antagonist, which was illegal. I mean, the dueling was the illegal part, but the wounding the person was the part that caused attention to it. So he had to relocate to New York and was kind of trying to bring sophisticated British legal print culture to America. And he thought this trial was so sensational and had attracted so much public attention that the publishing a report of it would reflect well on him and ingratiate him with New York's legal community. But it had the opposite effect, because the defense lawyers there were 6 high-powered defense lawyers during the trial, and they were horrified at the idea that what they said during the trial would be published.
And we'll get into what it was that they said and why they would be so afraid for that to be publicly disseminated. So the trial took place in 1793, and New York was a very different place at that time, and the circumstances, the social circumstances, the political circumstances had a huge outcome, I think we can say, on the flow of the case and the ultimate decision. Could you set us up a little bit, what New York was like during that time?
So New York in 1793, and we have a rotating map along the way here. But the basic point is New York in 1793 was tiny, tumultuous, and full of anxiety. In terms of size, New York's population in 1793 was about 40,000 people, so really kind of a small town, not 8 million. And almost everybody lived within about a mile of the southern tip of Manhattan, basically within a mile of the Battery. Almost everybody lived really below where City Hall currently is. So that little triangle in the heart of that image that's a 1797 map. That's City Hall Park. So the city is tiny. It's very face-to-face. It's like the size of a modern state university. So not everybody knew each other, but it was quite intimate. But the city was also really divided in 1793. This was a time in the aftermath of the American Revolution where Americans were really still negotiating what our political system would look like and what the relations between different groups of people in American society would be. This was a period of anti-slavery activism and self-liberation by the city's enslaved population. And this was a period of fierce struggles between working class men, many of whom were not allowed to vote, and the city's economic and social elite who dominated the political system both in the state and in the city. and nationwide. And political divisions in the city were really exacerbated during 1793 by the progress of the French Revolution, which sent floods of refugees from France into the city and from Saint-Domingue because of the Haitian Revolution there. So the city was full of examples or standard bearers for much more radical visions of democracy and republicanism than had really previously developed in American politics. Alexander Hamilton complained that the city was divided between aristocrats and Democrats. He sided with the aristocrats, just so you know. In fact, many political leaders, founding fathers from this time, didn't think that democracy was a good idea. Noah Webster arrived in the city right around the time that Lana Sawyer met Harry Bedloe in August of 1793 and was horrified to find that people were singing the Marseillaise and chanting Vive la République and also Down with King Washington.
And this really came to a head because the crime that's at the center of your book that starts your narrative, or Lana's narrative, is Lana Sawyer, who's a sewing girl. Mm-hmm. She's working class. Her stepfather is a branch pilot, so they have a comfortable life, but they're not exorbitantly wealthy. Mm-hmm. And then she has a chance encounter with Henry Bedloe, who is a gentleman in class, if not in action. He's from a wealthy family. He's accustomed to privilege and the protections that offers. Mm-hmm. And so the case really brings to a head these kind of simmering social tensions.
Exactly.
Of that time period.
So the case evolved as a kind of parable or a class became a real focus of I'm completely lost for words. Class became an important valence through which, or lens through which people saw this encounter. And class played a very important role in the trial and in the public reaction to the trial. Just for fun, I'll show you the Henry Bedloe's family, the Rutgers family, owned all of this land. And they were among the property holders from the 18th century who owned large farms just outside of the built-up city, and in the 1750s had made a plan for long-term real estate development based on a rent and hold model. And so the families that rented and held became phenomenally rich. And his was one of them.
And we think of Liberty Island, where the Statue of Liberty is. We call it Liberty Island now, but it was once Bedloe Island, yes, named after the family. So yes, also reflecting their long-term
Yeah, they were early Dutch settlers in the city. Mm-hmm.
I think just sort of broad strokes for folks who haven't read the book yet. Mm-hmm. Lana encounters Henry, although he does not say that he does not identify himself.
Yeah, this goes back to the size of the city. So Lana Sawyer was walking down Broadway on a Sunday and was being harassed, catcalled by a group of Frenchmen, probably French refugees. And this gentleman interposed to send the men away and to escort her home. And he did walk her home, and he asked her out for a walk a couple days later, and he introduced himself as Lawyer Smith, which was not his name. But it does begin with an L and an S, like Lana Sawyer, so he was using what was available. But he had to give a false name because he had a terrible reputation already in the city as a sexual predator by the age of 27. So this was a city where Lana didn't recognize him by sight, but she knew his reputation. So He was disguising his identity.
And so he, sort of instigates these various meetings with her. He ingratiates himself into her company. He builds up a level of trust with her.
Yes.
So that he can get her into a situation where he can exploit that.
Yeah, it's a very common dynamic in modern acquaintance rapes. But he invited her out for a walk. He told her that they were going to go and meet a friend of hers and another gentleman so they wouldn't be alone. But the other friend was not there, and that was a lie. They stopped for ice cream on Broadway, which was kind of a luxury at the time. They went for a walk on the Battery, which is perfectly respectable, very common. Battery, just so you know, had just been opened as a public park. There were trees planted, young little elm trees planted along the Battery, surrounded by cages, wooden cages, to keep marauding pigs from eating them, because people kept pigs in their little back quarters of their houses for food. And then time passed, and it became late enough that Lana was becoming anxious that her parents would be upset with her for staying out so long. And so he said, "Oh, I'll walk you home," but he didn't walk her home. He ended up dragging her into a brothel. It was a complicated procedure there, up by City Hall Park.
I think we have.
And this is a crazy image from your collections, drawn by the son of George Washington's dentist, who grew up in that neighborhood and published these reminiscences. Didn't publish. He drew and wrote reminiscences of the city of New York in his old age in the 1850s. And they're full of these crazy, awesome drawings of buildings from his childhood and stories about the people that lived in them. And this was one of the remarkable sources that I came across here that just happened to be so useful, because he literally has Mother Carey's house. And there's a little figure in the doorway that I like to think of as Mother Carey.
And he has a wild anecdote, too, where his little sister is being baptized.
So Mother Carey's brothel was across the street from what used to be the Brick Presbyterian Church. It's now not a church. I think for a time it was the New York Times building. But in any case, it was across the street from a church, and when he tells the story about when his younger sister was being baptized, there was no vessel to hold the water for the baptism in the church, and they sent some guys out to run around the neighborhood and come back with a bucket of some kind. And they went across the street and got a punch bowl from Mother Carey.
So the little sister of the son of George Washington's dentist was baptized in a punch bowl
from a
whorehouse. Brothel. There you go. Can't make it up.
But this was a period in which prostitution was very common, and brothels functioned as an open secret unless some kind of problem happened. 1793, during the year of 1793, there were 6 other brothels on this one block that got into trouble, which is why we know about them.
And Mother Carey, who was the brothel keeper, was a very canny woman, I think we can say, but both she and Henry Bedloe really underestimated Lana and made a huge miscalculation in terms of how they thought that she would react to
Yeah, in 1793, like today, most people who are victims of acquaintance rape, that is, who know their assailants, don't file official reports of any kind. Some estimates say 2/3, some estimates say 85%. In any case, it's a large majority. And the reason they don't is because the legal recourse is such an ordeal and so difficult to obtain. And in 1793, I think both Harry Bedloe and Mother Carey, the madam who owned this brothel, thought that Lana Sawyer would emerge from this brothel the next morning and want to slink away in shame and silence and not cause them any trouble. In fact, there's a fascinating moment in the Lana's narrative during the trial where she describes emerging the next morning. Henry Bedloe, who had kind of trapped her in the room overnight, gets dressed and says, "I'm leaving, and you're going to have to get gone because Mother Carey doesn't want you lounging around here. She's got a business to run." And so Lana kind of stakes sock and looks at her dress, which had been torn. I want to talk about the dress if we have a minute. And sews her dress back together and steps out into the hallway, which is this tiny space we happen to know is it's 3 feet wide hallway, so not regulation today. And Mother Carey's standing there waiting for her, and Mother Carey says, "Dearie," with kind of shocking familiarity. "Dearie, I can show you out the back door, or I can check and see out front if there's anyone in the street." Casting Lana in the role of a shamed young woman who doesn't want to be seen. And Lana has this flash of anger, which is really extraordinary. She says, "No, I will go out the front door, and I don't care who sees me, even if it's my father." In fact, the minute she got out the front door and stood on the stoop of Mother Carey's house, she could literally see her parents' house on Gold Street 2 blocks away, almost literally. When I say literally, I mean almost literally. She could see the house next door. But instead of going immediately home, she spent all day reeling in distress and disorientation and anxiety about how she was going to get home and explain to her parents what happened without her stepfather just beating her up and kicking her out.
Yeah, so maybe I think that's a good segue to talk about the sources that you were consulting, because you were in your account of what happened in the brothel and in the following day when she's walking through the city, we're really getting a almost minute-by-minute street-level view that you're constructing through such a wide variety of sources, starting with clothing and the dress that she would have likely worn and what we can learn from that item. So maybe you can talk a little bit about some of the things that stuck out to you.
So this case, the story took place so long ago in a city that's so different from modern New York that I really wanted readers to be able to envision the world that Lana Sawyer lived in. And part of that was visual. What did the city look like? Part of that was other senses. What was the weather like at a particular time? What was the light like at a particular time of day? What were the smells, textures? And clothing was an important part of that. I also did a lot of work using tax records and city directories from the collections here, trying to piece together who lived where, and maps, and also manuscript maps and other real estate records. You have a whole collection of New York City street scenes organized block by block, which was super convenient. And there's all sorts of cool, amazing resources in New York City for studying real estate history. But that was very meticulous, painstaking work to do the mapping. One of the material objects that I looked at that was most revealing to me was my pursuit of the gown. I wanted to have an image in the book, and I wanted to understand myself what this gown was like, how it was constructed, what it would have looked like. Because it's what she had been wearing, it's the only piece of clothing of hers that was described. It was described as a calico gown with a drawn frill around the neck that was held together with a combination of pins and strings. And so I began researching using historians of fashion, historians of clothing, and kind of ended up in a dead end because 1793 was kind of in the middle of a transition between the kind of Mantuas of the mid-18th century with a very defined, very conical torso and big voluminous waists. You think of them as like what Queen Charlotte is wearing in Bridgerton. So that's like up to the 1790s. And then after the 1790s, it's more kind of Jane Austen-y, Empire style, Marie Antoinette, chemise dresses, literally shirt dresses, loose, unstructured, flowing gowns that become increasingly diaphanous over time. And so 1793 was in the middle of a transition, and people were wearing all kinds of stuff. So there was no real way to predict what somebody had to be wearing. I used a lot of visual evidence to try and narrow the options down, but I ended up going to consult with the leading experts in the field at different institutions. Winterthur was one of them, but the key moment for me was I went up to Williamsburg, Colonial Williamsburg, to see kind of the great authority on clothing in this period, Linda Baumgarten, and she kindly made time for me and went through the history of fashion here, and she's like, yeah, you're kind of stuck, but you know, the pins give you a clue, and the pins mean that the bodice of the gown was held together in the front with pins. So it would have been worn over a shift, which was like an undershirt, and then over a corset, which would have given structure and definition to the shape. So the gown itself could be held together by pins because the gown itself never faced any real stress. It was just wrapped around and pinned on. And then the skirts, because the waist was so tight, the skirt had to have some kind of drop panel or seam or other fastening because you had to get it over your hips or over your shoulders. Are you with me? And that's where the strings come through. She said, so it was probably this kind of gown, which is known as a round gown with a drop panel, and the drop panel is probably where the strings come in, and the pins came down the front, and that show it's a kind of a modest cotton gown, which would have been a really fancy gown for somebody like Lana Sawyer. And I was like, great. And she drew me sketches, and I still have my little Post-it notes she wrote the sketches on. I felt like I was all done. And she said, but that's not what's interesting about this case. And I said, really? She said, first of all, the fact that the gown was torn, while in the trial it said that the gown was torn and the strings were torn off, while Henry Bedloe was tearing it off of Lana's body. And she says, that's pretty, and the gown itself was introduced as forensic evidence, the only forensic evidence introduced during the trial. She said, that's very clear evidence that this was an assault. Because no young woman in 1793 was going to damage her gown taking it off. In this period, the sewing was not expensive. The labor of someone like Lana Sawyer, who worked as a seamstress, was cheap. But the cloth itself was very expensive for somebody like Lana. So she would never, it doesn't make any sense for her to have damaged her own gown. This is not like your modern romance novels where people are tearing their clothes off. I think King George the other day pulled all his buttons off. It's like, whatever. Point is, so there's that. I was like, oh. So like there's actual forensic value to the gown that doesn't exist, but we have this description of. And then she said, there's something else that's interesting about the gown. She says, the fact that he wanted to take it off tells you something about his sexual aim. Because he didn't need to take the gown off to have sex with her because nobody really wore underwear in this period. He could have just lifted up her petticoats and dropped his front panel and had intercourse. The fact that he took the gown off means he wanted her naked, that there's a kind of, that he had a scene, that, it's in a bed, she's naked. There's a kind of scenario that he had in mind that was specific to his goal. So that tells us about something about what he was up to. So I'm very grateful to the incredible expertise of all the curators of objects, who have helped me interpret things like portrait miniatures and furniture that was in the room, and in this case, some of the clothing, because so many people have so much incredible knowledge, and you got to go ask.
And connected to the clothing, I should also, a hat tip to New York Historical, that one of the things that you were looking at was what the weather was like.
Yes.
In order to determine what kind of clothing would be appropriate, and you know, her walks through the Battery, what that was like. And you actually, I think we have, here we go. You actually used the garden diary of one of the founders of New York Historical, John Pintard, to connect those dots.
So John Pintard is kind of a curious, interesting figure. I don't know actually that much about his biography, except that he, when the building that housed, the trial took place in a building called City Hall, otherwise known as Federal Hall, because it was redesigned and reconfigured by Pierre L'Enfant to house the Federal Congress. And it was new furnished with new furniture in 1788, are you with me? And that was the furniture that would have been in when the Congress moved to Philadelphia, it was returned to use as City Hall and a courtroom. And when the building was demolished to build the current City Hall in like 1810, John Pintard collected some of the furniture from the building. So there's tables and chairs in your collections here that came from that building. And there is the balcony, the wrought iron balcony railing from the building is here, which I described in the book because I thought that was just so cool that we have these crazy artifacts of that structure. And I'm now off kilter. Here we are, John Pintard. So he was, he was living in Newark because he was under threat of arrest for debt. So he was basically camping out in Newark, trying to avoid debtor's prison in the city, and spending his time keeping meticulous meteorological records. So he measured the weather 3 times a day and described other conditions relating to mostly gardening. But he's one of several weather diaries I was able to look at. Noah Webster kept weather diaries. There are others. But these are an incredible kind of source because they let you, they're being used these days for people doing climate research. And I think there's references to that downstairs. But for me, they were important to understand kind of what the weather was like, what it felt like, whether it was hot or cold, rainy or snowy.
Yeah, it's interesting when we have this material that the creator never could have conceived of why it would be useful or why it would be valuable, the entry points that researchers can bring to a document to make use of it in so many different ways. And so speaking of Lana and her dress, one of the things that's so striking about your book is how focused it is on Lana and how close you follow her perspective or as close as you can get to what her perspective would be. And can you tell me a little bit, or tell us a little bit about that choice that to create such a close POV in Lana's experiences in New York? How difficult was that? Did that shape how you approached the material that you consulted?
Yeah, I knew from pretty early on that I wanted Lana Sawyer at the center of the story, this 17-year-old seamstress. I really wanted the story to revolve around her decisions, her reactions, her sense of what her options were, and how the decisions of other characters influenced what kinds of possibilities were available to her. I didn't want the sexual assault to be at the center of the book, and in fact, I never narrate the assault itself. I wanted the focus in the book to be her response, how she reacted. And I also wanted it to be clear in the book that, and this required different kinds of research, I wanted to be very clear that this event didn't define her life. It's kind of the moments of lightning in the night where we see her, but that we know her story began long earlier. So I traced her childhood as best I can, and found out some interesting things, which I helped to try to describe, and that her life went on after this incident. And some of the complicated things that happened, I'm able to describe and in great detail, and some things are much more mysterious. But I wanted it clear to the reader that this was a moment in her life that extended before and went on afterwards. There was one moment that isn't really based on archival research, sorry.
I'll allow it.
That was a moment where focusing on being focused, passive voice, being focused on her point of view really enriched my thinking. And that was the moment where she attempts suicide, which I had used at the end of a chapter on the public response, the public outrage at the outcome of the rape trial. And the next chapter, so one chapter ends with her attempting suicide, and the next chapter kind of began with another legal strategy her family pursued. And I was really lucky to have the novelist, wonderful novelist, Katie Simpson-Smith, read the manuscript early enough in the process to say, John, you can't just leave her literally hanging. That's too abrupt, it's too shocking, and it's too hard on the reader. The reader needs you to hold their hands. And I'm like, all right, I'm a little autistic, so I need human psychology explained to me on occasion. And she said, you need 2 pages holding the reader's hand at that moment. And I was like, 2 pages? Like, what am I going to say? Like, she was really depressed. But I began doing a different kind of research. I began researching suicide and ideas about suicide in the late 18th century. Richard Bell has written a good book on it. And I began reading modern research, especially global health, public health research about broad patterns. And of course, I was reading Herman's book on trauma and recovery. Point is, I tried to read this kind of psychological and sociological literature as best I could. And there were some patterns that really came up that seemed plausible. I wasn't trying to take modern Twitter generation and project them back into the 1790s, but there were some patterns that seemed like they were pretty plausible and seemed resonant. And 2 of them were that people who kill themselves these days tend to be people who feel, ironically, both isolated and also like they're a burden. So it's often people who feel they have no one to turn to, but also that often it's the family members. They feel like they're dragging the family down. And it was easy to see how Lana could feel both alone after the outcome of the rape trial, and also like she was bringing shame and trouble to her family. And that really, so I narrate some of that in the book, and that really helped change how I thought about the next legal strategy the family pursued, which was this crazy seduction suit. It helped me think of that case, in some ways in a more optimistic way, in which I'd seen that more as exploitative on her stepfather's part. And I came to see that more as possibly a good thing for Lana, whatever his intentions were, because it gave her a sense of being on a team. That was a legal strategy that required her participation, so it gave her a sense of belonging. And it was a legal strategy that had the potential, and in fact did, end up resulting in very substantial money, huge, enormous money damages against Henry Bedloe. So it not just let her hold him accountable in a very significant way, it also made her part of a team within her family and gave her a kind of I think a sense of, made her feel like she was a valued and contributing member of the household. Mm-hmm. So that's me imagining her psychology, which I make clear, like that's me imagining. But that was how that research was shifted by trying to focus on Lana's point of view and in the absence of other clear evidence.
Yeah, filling in, when I was reading these parts, they were very interior, where you were, entertaining options of what she might be thinking at this time, especially when she's wandering through New York the day after, and she's, stopping to see family. She's sitting by the bathhouse. Why was she postponing her return to her family? And it, this idea of, it made me think of Saidiya Hartman and this idea of radical imagination, and that you're putting yourself in this person's frame of mind so that you can think of maybe more creative ways to document something that is not documented, because she's, of course, a marginalized voice in terms of the historical record.
Yeah, Saidiya Hartman is such an inspiring historian, and I've read that literature with great interest. I must say, there were two things I kind of wanted to avoid. I wanted to avoid a lot of like, maybe she did this. It's possible that blah, 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 because I was like, oh God, that's just so tedious. And I also wanted just to avoid offering an imaginary scenario as though it actually happened. So I tried to avoid kind of creative fabulation. So it's clearly marked where I'm speculating, but I don't attribute anything to Lana's interiority that isn't, I think, documented and clarified. For the moment after the assault, the day after, there actually is good evidence in the trial record that she was really distraught and disoriented. And I understood that in part by reading modern narratives like Chanel Miller's memoir, Know My Name, about her experience. That was it's a beautiful memoir, but very smart about storytelling.
So I want to give us time for questions from the audience. So my last question that I'll pose to you before I give up the floor is, so you wanted to present Lana as a character that existed before and after this attack, but after the second trial, the seduction trial, she disappears from the documentary record. So what was that like for you? Was that difficult? Did you find that there was an aspect of grace to her being able to kind of escape this notoriety, or are you still hunting down documents?
Yes, it was difficult. I spent years trying to find some trace of Lana Sawyer or Lana Steinmetz, her married name, in the late 19th century, late 18th, early 19th century. I was so frustrated that I could find out so much crazy stuff about Henry Bedloe and his 8 illegitimate children he had after he got out of debtor's prison, and Lana's half-sisters and her brothers. One of her full sisters became a really kind of notorious madam in the city on a parcel of land owned by Henry Bedloe's family, so that was kind of crazy. But she constantly she was a fierce woman. I mean, she was getting prosecuted for attempted murder because she would say, like, I'm going to cut you, and people believed that she was going to kill him. So Lana had this very rough sister, and Lana herself disappeared. And it's pretty clear to me from the available evidence that she got married and that she moved away from the city. And so I was trying to understand that. I finally gave up and was like, that's what I know. And I've done a lot of book clubs, which include a lot of serious genealogists. And so I often get like, I was wondering what happened to Lana. So I spent last week researching this. And I'm like, and I'm always kind of anxious because like I kind of want them to find her, and then I also don't want to be proved incompetent.
Well, all
And
it
they're
takes is someone to be cleaning out their attic, and then they find.
And then they usually then end that by saying like, and I think you're right, she disappeared. And I'm like, doing my best. So just as a matter of method, I think there is a certain grace, I think that was a nice way of putting it, that I think Lana, I just want to explain, give me 2 minutes, I'll explain why I think this makes sense. I found a really weird, interesting, disturbing parallel between the Lana Sawyer, Harry Bedloe case and Alexander Hamilton's Maria Reynolds scandal. And I do think that Bedloe and Hamilton was working as Bedloe's lawyer to get him out of debtor's prison for several years.
We didn't even get to the Alexander.
We didn't even get to that. But I came to believe that they really did feed each other's worst instincts, those two men. And I used the Maria Reynolds example as a way of helping me think through what some of the possibilities for Lana Sawyer were. Maria Reynolds was this woman who was defamed by Hamilton, first privately in 1792 as a woman he allegedly had an adulterous affair with. He was trying to prove that he was an adulterer, not an embezzler. And then in 1797, when he was publicly accused of financial impropriety as head of the Treasury Department, he published this long, crazy account, which included a series of letters that he attributed to Maria Reynolds, which I think are pretty clearly forged. But I'm not the first person to say that. But the point is, she was living in Philadelphia at the time and did not respond. And in fact, she and her new husband, James Klingman, moved to England for a number of years. And then several years after that, she moved back to Philadelphia, got remarried, and kept a very low profile. Very few people knew that Maria Klingman was actually Maria Reynolds. She clearly felt that that was something she needed to share with her husband and a select number of other individuals, but that she clearly wanted to leave the scandal behind her and didn't want to be viewed that way. And so that gave me a model. I was thinking of Natalie Davis, one of my graduate teachers, who wrote The Return of Martin Guerre based on very rich but incomplete records. And she said that when that was made into a movie, one of her rules was that the dialogue had to be something that was said at the time, that we know was said at the time. And so that was, for me, Maria Reynolds seeking a kind of reboot to her life through anonymity, gave me a way of understanding why Lana might well have wanted to be away from New York, to move on with her life in a new place, full of new to recreate who she wanted to be.
So at this point, I hope that you have some questions for Dr. Sweet, and if you do, please raise your hand, and one of my colleagues will come over with a mic so that everyone can hear you and it can be present on our recording.
Excuse me. How hard was it to get the prosecutors to bring this case? Was that difficult, and how if at all, was that coaxing done?
Mm-hmm. So there's a chapter in the book called Gatekeepers, which is about that process. I think the answer is the process was difficult. In this period, there was no police in the city, so if you wanted to report a crime, a serious crime, you went to one of the aldermen, which is the equivalent of the modern city council, and the head alderman was the mayor. So in this case, they decided to go to the mayor. One of the really unusual things in this case was that, so one point is that Lana's reaction followed a pattern that Sharon Block documented in her broad-based study of sexual assault cases in early America. She looked at like 900 cases. And she found that sexual assault survivors tend to first go to a peer which Lana did. When she was on her way home, she picked up a friend to walk her home. And then they go to the mother, which Lana did because she knew she needed to get to her mother first to avoid the stepfather being the first person. And then the stepfather makes a decision about whether to go forward with the prosecution and make the case public or to try and cover it up. So the first obstacle was the stepfather. I'll just say the really interesting thing he did, and I think it's a sign that Harry Bedloe really underestimated him. I think Harry Bedloe had walked Lana home, he saw the kind of house they lived in and thought, oh, working class people, no trouble. But John Callanan, Lana's stepfather, turned out to be ferocious as an advocate for her and really smart legally. And that only became clear over time. But what he did was he took Lana first to an investigation to confront Mother Carey, which must have been super traumatic, and then to a private attorney. And that private attorney, I think they wanted for two reasons. One was to kind of evaluate their case, and the other was to write up a formal complaint, which is a way of gaining control over what is in the legal record. So I think they were aware this was a difficult process, and then, and as now, when you enter the criminal justice system, you give up a lot of control over your own story and who's going to believe it. Lana turned out to be very persuasive at each step, but her family also helped her keep control as much as possible throughout the legal process.
Thank you very much. Not to give away your whole book, but walk us briefly through the trial, the verdict, and the civil case.
You have 2 hours. The rape trial, like most trials in that period, took place in one day, and it took place within about 6 weeks of the assault. So justice in the 18th century was fast. The trial began, it was said in the published report that the trial took 15 hours. I know the trial did not take 15 hours, but almost 15 hours, because there was a forgery case ahead of it. So they sat for this trial beginning at about 11 a.m. and went straight through until about 1 a.m., which I know because of some crazy diary at Columbia. I finally figured that one out, like right before publication. And the line in the trial report is that the jury deliberated for, the trial took 15 hours, and the jury deliberated for 15 minutes, and delivered what was for many surprising as a verdict, which was not guilty.
And this was a capital offense if he were found guilty.
I don't think that's as big a deal as people say it is, because they hanged people for all kinds of stuff. I think 5 forgers were found guilty in the hour between 10 a.m. and 11 a.m., and they were all hanged within 2 weeks. So they weren't squeamish about hanging people. But they were very good in rape trials in this period about focusing attention on the perpetrator. And I think that's a dynamic we see a lot today, is an emphasis on what the man has to lose rather than what the woman has already lost. Partly because by the time you get to the trial, she's already suffered the damages that she suffered, whereas he stands to, not get his seat on the Supreme Court or whatever.
You have a really good, one of the sources that you cite with this is another diary that we have here. It's an individual whose friend is accused of rape, and he writes in his diary, is it just that a woman should be allowed such liberty as to swear away the life of a man? No man is absolutely safe if women are disposed to injure them. Which felt, when I read that, I was like, yeah, I've read that tweet before. It felt like your classic kind of Me Too blowback.
Yeah, that was
commentary.
a Columbia student whose friend had been accused of rape, who was from the Ludlow family, rich banking and legal family. And they managed to delay his indictment for 9 months and then get him out of the country to one of their plantations in Jamaica before he was arrested. So that was an example where, like, there's this enormous exaggeration of a woman's power to take the life of a man. It's like, no, she did not have any power to do that. His family was quite capable of evading justice.
So I think that we might have time for one quick question. One more in the back.
I'm a little curious about how this woman was able to bring this litigation at all, given that at this period of time, women couldn't sign their own contracts, they couldn't on their own sue in tort. If her family had not been supportive, her stepfather, would this just have been impossible for her to go forward with?
Yes. I think I'll be short. One of the key things about this trial, I think, is it really helped shape modern rape culture by helping to not in a good way, but by helping to establish a distinction in law between how acquaintance rapes cases are evaluated and how stranger rape cases are evaluated. Because they have very different power dynamics. Stranger rape cases are often useful for those in power to prosecute, and acquaintance rapes are often inconvenient for those in power to see prosecuted. And so it's part of what this trial did was raise a very difficult standard for proof and persuasion in an acquaintance rape case. And part of that was because of the way the defense attorneys, there were 6 defense attorneys, changed the legal standards as much as they could during the course of the trial and slandered Lana Sawyer as much as they could throughout the trial. And it's a phenomenon that I think, while emphasizing that Harry Bedloe was a citizen whose life was on the line. And it's a phenomenon that I think, I'm coming back to your question, it has to do with, I think, a sense of who matters. And I think one of the remarkable things about Lana Sawyer herself is that she had this amazing conviction that she mattered enough to go to seek justice. And her family agreed that that they mattered enough, that they were significant enough, that they weren't people who should be dismissed. This is something that the philosopher at Cornell, Kate Mann, describes in modern rape trials as himpathy, in which the trial tends to focus attention on the man and sympathy with the man rather than sympathy with the woman. And that's a common tactic in this kind of trial, is to attack the woman so that the jury doesn't think she matters, while they think that he does because he needs to be a varsity swimmer or graduate from Stanford or whatever. Does it make sense? So what's remarkable, I think, about this family is their conviction that they were people who mattered, even though they weren't socially prominent.
John Woodsweet, thank you so much for your time and your scholarship and for using our extraordinary collections here. And thank you so much, Meredith Mann. This is the inaugural primary source. Please come back for more conversations like this. Meredith, our wonderful curator of manuscripts who spearheaded this whole thing. So thank you, Meredith.
Thanks, Valerie. Thank you all for coming.